Zoom video. This is Whiskey Bravo 5 Delta, the Medical Amateur Radio Council. Today, our Grand Rounds on the Air Net is going to be having a roundtable discussion about a topic that's amateur radio. So it's working 6 meters and 2 meters, speaking to faraway stations, catching the DX bug. As a group of health professionals, as well as people interested in healthcare, we hate to use the word catching any kind of a bug, but if this is infectious and you catch the hobby and find it to be gratifying, we'd be thrilled to have you. So if you're a member of the general community that's finding us through a YouTube video that we may make off of this recording, please enjoy this. So 6 meters, I mean, is it a high frequency band? Where can I contact? What tools can I use to assist myself? And can I talk to the Northern Hemisphere? Can I catch Europe and Asia, North and Central America, the Oceania, Pacific, Australia, South America, and Antarctica? Well, we can at different times with different approaches, with different tools. So historically, and many of our members that have been members for years, those of us that grew up in the 1960s, 1970s, 1980s, and even 1990s, we did have a problem with 6 meters. It was a band whose frequency was shared with, were very close to television frequencies. So for us to transmit and try to use any kind of power was problematic for interfering with our neighbors. That's not true anymore with digital TV. We don't have that limitation. Also, the equipment, standard equipment for talking around the world, the transceivers did not have 6 meters of the band on most from the genre. Now they do. Now we have different tools. We don't have to worry about TVI. The entry level is very simple. There's a lot of advantages to getting on 6 meters. Can it act like an HF band? Well, it is the magic band, so we're going to hear some more about that today. Now, different kinds of modes and different kinds of tools. And here we're operating on voice, for those of you that aren't familiar with amateur radio. But amateur radio operators, when we talk about the 6 meter band, we know that the general public may not have the concept that we do. We're not one frequency when we get on the radio. Our radio stations, we have a whole spectrum to work with, everywhere from microwave down to long wave. And we have frequencies that are right at the border of AM radio band. We can talk to Japan on the same radio frequencies pretty much that you listened to your car years ago, radio stations. We have ones what would be similar to the FM band and that kind of range. Every single band in the spectrum has different characteristics, and 6 meters is no different. But we also do more than just voice contact. We can do Morse code, we can do digital modes, and there's many different digital modes for different purposes. Some are intended for fast decoding, slow decoding. We have digital signal processing. We think about what a computer can do that we can't do. We can't think at that level and process as quickly as a computer. It can take a signal and listen to it, and millions of times go through that signal. And even though we audibly can't decode the information with our ears, the computer can. It can assemble that, and very, very weak signals become possible. And we're talking about some of the modes today that are weak signal work. So we hope that this will interest you, and you'll learn some different terms. You'll learn about WSJT. If you're not familiar with it, sporadic E, EME, or Earth, Moon, Earth, meteor scatter. Just think about as an amateur radio operator what you're able to do. I mean, we know we've got young kids that are interested in video games, robotics. We start talking about space weather in space. This is the perfect medium for getting them interested in amateur radio. So let's make sure that we spread the word and let them know about all these modern tools and purposes we have. So for 6 meter activity, your life cycle does not really have to be in sync with the solar cycle, but it does help. I mean, we're going to talk about things like transequatorial propagation today, sporadic E, digital modes and space weather, and meteor scatter, but we also have to realize that in talking on 6 meters, we're reliant on the solar cycle if we want to have the normal type of operating on high frequency where we talk about the world. That doesn't happen very often on 6 meters. And that we're in cycle 25 of the sunspot cycle. The solar cycle was projected to be a moderate one. Seems like it's being a little more excessive. And as today, as we're going to talk, and many of you are going to share your information and your participation and talk about where you're seeing the solar cycle and what impact it has, you're going to find that 6 meters is going to be the magic band. This is the time in the life cycle to find some time for amateur radio. Do we have any questions or input now? I'm going to go ahead and break one, take a list of anybody that would like to offer their participation. Okay, no additional contributors. We do have Whiskey Bravo 2 Foxtrot Kilo Oscar with us. And we also have Harry WB 9 EDP. So between the two of them, we're going to get a wonderful contribution from experts in the fields and at different levels, some at the physics level. And you know, we're not going to make it too extensive where you can't understand, but we certainly want to get the ball rolling. And there is a lot of science behind this. And again, these are the types of reasons why young teenagers should get engaged in amateur radio. But you know, what else do we have at our fingertips these days that we never had before? You don't have to travel to Greece to visit the Oracle at Delphi to get answers. And think all these Pythias you have online to visit with. You've got Google, you've got YouTube, any search engine. If you have a question about something, there's no reason why you can't find the information yourself. You're self-selected on that. And no different when we're talking about 6 meters and propagation and operation. Our signals being reflected by interaction with the sun, but is there a magnetic field component too? There's a lot of space weather as well as geophysical weather that's important. Harry and I were talking earlier about wanting to travel back to the future to 1957 for the geophysical year, where the high frequency bands were off the chart because of the solar activity. But we're getting a pretty good solar activity right now. You're in the right place at the right time, and perhaps this will be the season for it. There's space weather sites you can find online, and you certainly can find all kinds of tools to predict propagation, the ability to talk from one place on the Earth to another place on the Earth on a different frequency, 6 meters be included. These are all tools that were more difficult to come by years ago. Individuals wanted to get into these types of ham radio activities. And it's more, again, than just the solar flux or the sunspot numbers. Now we have all kinds of charts available to us that look at the magnetic activity, whether or not we're going to have a quiet atmosphere, and different aspects of 6 meters are affected by that. We also have a maximum usable frequency, and we can look and see that online. So all these charts are available, the tools are available online, and if you're listening on the air, hopefully you'll find Healthcare Ham's YouTube channel later, and we'll put a video up that has all that for you. But looking at space weather is no different. There's all kinds of different aspects that affect the ability of transmissions. But if you have an entry-level license, here's the magic. You can work a lot of around the world contacts because 6 meters is enabled for you. The magic band as a technician. You don't have to have the higher level licenses. It's very easy and very convenient to get a technician license. You can do that in an online course and find a local volunteer group to give you the exam. And you can talk all over the world. You certainly different times of the year, even when we don't have the sunspots being active. There's other modes of talking from one spot to another on 6 meters, and we'll cover some of that today. Do you need high power? Well, you could be on voice. It'd be nice to have a little bit of power, but you can be successful barefoot at 100 watts with and without a directional gain antenna. You can just use a wire. Think of the wavelength of 6 meters for us. When you think about 6 meters in terms of what it means converting from the metric system, in its length, it's not very long. And if you're looking at half wavelength, even shorter. I'm going to go ahead and take some input. Do we have any input from our members? Andy, would you like to make any comments, WJAP?
Okay, well, what you brought up is very, all very accurate. And many of us did not have 6 meters, like you said, when we were brought up in amateur radio, because usually you had to buy a separate transceiver to do that. But 6 meters, typically, my experience with it, when it's there, it is fantastic. Signals are good, they're strong, very readable. When it's gone, and you pretty much have to check it frequently. either rely on a spotting service or just check it yourself, and keep track of the news things about the sunspots, in order to enable it. So that's all I have for now.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. That's WJB, Andy in the Columbus area. We have Mike, WB2FKO. Mike, if you're available and would like to answer this question. So Mike, from a standpoint of interaction in the atmosphere when we do have F2 and reflection of our signals, is there any relationship between the short wavelengths and the ability to reflect and have lower power be more effective? Because I personally notice you don't need a lot of power on 10 meters, but if you would like to contribute to the WP2FKO, if you unmute and go ahead.
Yeah, the short answer is that yes, reflections from the ionosphere do depend on the frequency. The higher the ionization, the higher the frequency that can be reflected. But when the ionization is very, very high, you don't really need much. It's the marginal conditions where power becomes important.
Okay, thank you, Mike. Now, is that because of, in part because of polarization, or is there a relationship between the wavelength and the reflectivity? Or
It's more the latter. It's a question of what's called plasma physics.
okay, it sounds like a very deep subject, and we could spend an entire session on that. And I know Harry WB9EDP would say that as well. So maybe someday we'll get on there and talk about the actual physics of it. Thank you very much for the contribution.
If you want to go to my website, I have some tutorial papers on that for those that want to delve a little deeper. Just go to my website, look up my call sign, and you'll go right there.
Yeah, that's Whiskey Bravo 2 Foxtrot Kilo Oscar. So if you'd find that through his QRZ page, his website, you'll be able to find some more detailed physics information. Do we have anybody else that would like to comment on that? I'll take a list before I continue on with the roundtable discussion. Okay, I'm going to let WB9ETV go ahead, Harry, and let's hear.
Yes, well, keep the physics completely out of this one. No way past the forum. Basically, for someone starting out, what I've always tried to say is think of this trainer on the calendar. Some calendars have bigger balls, some calendars have very small holes, and you just it's not getting to the mathematics for me. Very technical. Obviously, if you put little noodles to a big calendar, they're going to go through. If you do the opposite, you will plus more needles and then you'll lose a little bit of water and so on. And that basically is how we start seeing these migrations of what we call now between disease, which is a totally unique situation. But Ian said this here as well as that too. That becomes very important. The concept of polarization, circular right-hand, left-hand polarization, that what Am said in the JPL with Voyager, and you're a new guy, and you really get into this. Imagine what it's like talking to the people on the space station. But think of it as a calendar, a strainer, and pasta. That takes the mathematics completely out of it. WB5D and WB9DDP.
Okay, thank you, Harry. WB9ADP. I told you we had two wonderful individuals that would make significant contributions to today's roundtable discussion. Thank you very much, and thank you both for offering to the expansive knowledge on the side, and keeping to the basics today. So Harry, we were talking about circular polarization, and we're also talking about getting on Google and other search engines. One thing we don't want you to do when you're searching information about circular polarization, do not look up right-hand circular polarization. It's RHCP. I did that with a student at the university one time, and what we got are pages and pages and pages right hand of the chili peppers, red hot chili peppers. So use left hand if you're going to do that, all jokes aside here. But we talk about the different modes and the successes that you have. Obviously, traditionally, if you were worried about having power output and having that signal, as both Harry and Mike were talking about, you could use Morse code that helped to overcome some of the limitations, or smaller bandwidth. You could certainly pick it out easier than the voice on 6 meters. That could be helpful at times. But now we've got digital modes, the digital signal processing I was talking about. We've got fantastic ways for having great conditions. When band conditions are challenging, low-powered simple wire antennas allow you to do things that could never be done before. That digital signal processes everything out of the noise, or quite frequently out of the noise. There's certain levels it can't. Obviously, there's a limit, but far beyond what was possible in the past. So years ago, for certain modes, you really needed a lot of power. But now, effective radiated power and high gain antennas are still important, but less important for enjoying the hobby. And certainly, as we talk about F2 today, the ability to use the atmosphere itself in ways that aren't available for 6 meters when it's not acting as an HF band, we'll be able to have that. So the digital modes we're talking about, you can look up WSJT, and that's a weak signal communication software that's free to the general public, WSJT-X. It's not the only software that is, but Joe Taylor, physicist at Princeton, offers this free to the public. What a wonderful contribution to change the lives of all amateur radio operators, and including specifically those of us that get to enjoy it on these transitional bands that are halfway between HF and VHF bands, which is what 6 meters is. And we'll be talking more about those modes today. But you have FT8, one of the most popular modes. In FT8, it's just so easy to use. Now, it's not a conversational mode, of course, it's only 13 characters that's exchanged, but it does constitute as a contact with the other person. But we use it for other reasons. It's not just because of awards. Even if you're a voice operator, you want to be able to use FT8, or at least use the tools online. But we even have things like chat groups online where share information about openings. The discussion this week that I've seen on the ON4 KST, that's Oscar November 4 Kilo Sugar Tango .info for his website. He has different discussion groups. One of them is for 50 megahertz, and it goes by region. And that's where people gather to talk about what's happening. And the discussion this week was a solar flux figure, 317, and what it meant. And the discussion was, and I've observed this week, we're seeing what looks like the propagation, the F2 propagation in the southern hemisphere, but not yet in the northern hemisphere. And it seems to be the consensus of those with a lot of experience through the sunspot cycles and the physics of it, that we're going to start to see F2 propagation on 6 meters shortly, perhaps by the end of the month, or in the next month or two, having to do, of course, with so many complicated aspects of atmospheric physics that I don't fully understand, neither do all the individuals making the contributions. A lot of it's observational. But we're starting to see that. I noticed yesterday that stations in Puerto Rico on 6 meters were talking to Malawi in Africa, in the southeast corner of Africa. And the openings were extensively long. They represented F2 openings. The openings in Argentina that I was seeing yesterday were to the east and the west, talking to Japan and Europe at the same time. Very long-term openings. So there are tools online that we'll discuss. PSK Reporter is one of them. You go to pskreporter.info, you can see you can choose what band you want to see. You can see what people are talking to each other. As I said earlier, if you have FT8, you transmit, and then you can actually see where you're being heard all over the world, and you know where the bands are open. Then you can move to voice communications, etc. So you do want to chat and share online, if at all possible, with other individuals about openings. And it also gives you the opportunity to know who might be coming on into network. Yesterday's discussion had people from Ascension Island, New Zealand, the west coast of the US, Gulf Coast of the US, all chatting at the time, to California, all chatting at the same time of what was happening what expects to be happening. So you can find out in other ways stations are receiving your transmission. There's a DX Maps as well, another site where you can find that, send a signal, see where you're being copied. And of course, the PSK reporter we've talked about. Now, I've used that. It's very helpful for me, particularly with sporadic heat propagation, where you have little bits of the atmosphere that get charged for whatever reason, whether they're meteors or airplanes, who knows what's bouncing. You know the physics of it perfectly because they're little patches that seem to bounce our signals, sometimes in multiple bounces. But when Japan starts to come into the southeastern United States a few different times of the year, you can actually watch it on that map. And you can see when they're copying your signal as well. I've worked Greenland the same way, and also in a little bit different version, using different types of propagation. We'll discuss. It's not all sporadic heat, but we know as amateur radio operators what the different ionized layers of the atmosphere are, their HF wave radio propagation. But using these tools let you know what openings you have, give you a good indicator of what particular mode you're looking at. This is the Whiskey Bravo 5 Delta identify. We're on the grand rounds of the air net. I know we've all been identifying as individuals along the way, but this is the net identification. We appreciate all amateurs for letting us use this frequency for our net and roundtable discussions. You again don't have to be a medical amateur radio council member to participate. All amateurs are encouraged to participate. If you're listening right now to the net, you haven't already checked in, we encourage all hams to check in. It helps us to target our discussion and modify it to meet the needs of the individuals that are participating. So if you'd like to check in, make your call right now to Whiskey Bravo 5 Delta. No additional ones. Do we have any questions or comments before we continue on with this discussion? As I say, it is roundtable and interactive. So I encourage you to ask questions or offer input. Go ahead. Okay, well, we had a swoosh there. Do we have anybody that would like to offer input or questions at this time? Make your call to WB5D.
WB9 comment.
B9EDP, go ahead with your comment.
You know, if we look at everything, strip away all the technology, all the acronyms and fancy stuff, the biggest enthusiasm for someone that's maybe not an amateur radio operator or relatively new to some areas is the fact that when we look at moon bouncing, which is a little bit different than standard propagation, to hear yourself come back if you're doing it audibly. You hear yourself coming back from the moon, or to talk to an astronaut to the ISS, and they come back here. So it's a little different. Or receiving cross-scan stuff from the RS satellite, or Voyager 1 and 2, who are still alive and well. So I think if people are not hams, boy, just to hear yourself coming back from space, you know, paraphrase a friend of mine, billions and billions of stars are out there, and we can bounce our data back and hear ourselves coming right back to us. It's as glorious as that. Over.
QSL, I absolutely agree with you, Harry, with the additional comment that we have satellites in orbit carrying amateur radio, orbiting satellites carrying amateur radio, Oscar satellites. And that gives you the ability to hear yourself coming back too, as well as others. You actually find your signal if you're doing an operation on a multi-frequency or what we call a linear satellite by listening for your signal to come back. And it's extremely exciting. Most of the students at the University of Florida, they get engaged in amateur radio. That's their entry level. So it's a great point, Harry. Now, Harry, one thing you mentioned before about the colander with the holes in it, it's a good thing the moon's not made out of Swiss cheese, because we would definitely have an Earth-Moon-Earth problem on our transmission. But getting into F2 propagation, you know, is it time for us to have those characteristics on the Magic Band? So watch the solar flux. We talked about some of the tools you can use, Google or any search engine, and you can put those words into the search engine. Solar flux, MUF, the maximum usable frequency, and the amateur radio, and just look at all that. And when you look at MUF maps, it gives you an indication. So I've looked at a few maps for the last few days, and I actually looked. I was up early this morning, about 2 or 3 in the morning, so obviously things weren't open here. But I looked at the MUF maps, and I looked at the contacts that were being made on PSK reporter, and some of them did take that characteristic. Some of the ones between Australia and Asia, they could have been trans-equatorial propagation, which we'll talk about, and they could have been sporadic heat that we talked about, but they may have very well represented some F2 propagation happening in the southern hemisphere. And that we talked about that situation in Argentina where they're talking to Japan and Europe at the same time for prolonged periods of time. I mean, that's not generally a sporadic heat or necessarily a trans-equatorial propagation modality, but it seems like they're enjoying the benefits of these high sunspot cycle numbers already. But with trans-equatorial propagation, there's certain times of the year you can have success by pointing down below the equator, having to do with, I guess, the magnetic lines of the Earth. So in my particular case in Florida, areas that are equivalently south of the equator that I have north, I have seemed to be at daily contacts for weeks on end here. And it's very difficult for me to actually make a contact north of that line or south of that line. For me, it's like Buenos Aires. I can just draw a line from Chile over to Uruguay and then make contact after contact after contact with people in the same geographic area. It sometimes extends out. The Falkland Islands extended out. So I've heard Tierra del Fuego. So here we are in the very southern tips of South America and the subantarctic areas, talking here to Florida. Now, they're depending upon the time the stations are on, because I've been trying to talk to Paraguay using that modality. And the stations from Paraguay tend to get on a little later when their F2 propagation is open to Asia. And when I'm able to copy them, there are times when they can't copy me. And some of the explanation is for those later openings, there actually is flutter in those signals, and the decoding of the signals isn't necessary, possible in 2 ways. So but we do have to be mindful. It's not that we're not putting out enough signal. It's complicated. You know, there's no one right explanation for everything. We don't always understand exactly what's going on in the background. But Earth, Moon, Earth on 6 meters, yeah. I've got an antenna. I just use my antenna as it is, point it towards the moon. And I want to let some others talk about their experiences with Earth, Moon, Earth, because mine are very primitive. My gain was so low that when they used the station Arecibo, it takes us, of course, Arecibo is not active right now in Puerto Rico, but they did Earth, Moon, Earth communication with a very high affected radiated power and receive gain. So the little guns here were able to talk. Would you like to, Harry, WB9EDP? I know that you did a lot of this early years ago. Tell us about the size of the antennas and the kind of power it took before we had digital modes to do these kind of contacts. Just briefly, go ahead.
WB9DP. Just an FYI, current situation, we're seeing some F2 passes right now, and from this location, between 40 meters and 10 meters. Australia's coming in as gangbusters, but there is a 2 F2 patches I encountered at 2:30 this morning local time, and I worked from Chicago on phone to Australia. So we had 2 650 megahertz patches of F2, plus a lot of long paths due to the auroral issues going on. As far as EME goes on 6 meters, when you talk about 50 megahertz, and we won't get into the wavelengths and all those calculations, but imagine a quad array of 11 element light space antennas. The boom in that case was close to 40 feet long, being fed with Andrew Heliac. It's a very heavy duty type of coax, similar to coax, that is very costly. and then that went to an amplifier with a pair of 3-500, these big tubes. We'll just say very big tubes to those that aren't familiar with that. In Class A, the grounded grid, they were tetras anyway. And then that went to a TR6, which was beyond, probably most of the young hands didn't know it. Just think of RL Drake, you could look online, and that was a dedicated transceiver for 6-meter work, and it focused really at 6 meters. It was very well done. It was tube, but very well built. But that's kind of what we used for EME. Of course, we had to move all of these antennas both as mist as well as elevation. So it was a massive array. And as a matter of fact, we're getting set to put another tower up here to do the same thing on a bigger scale and cover it all the way up to the 432 region of the band. So, but we'll concentrate all these 6 meters has been at, for me, particularly with meteor scatter and what we call plugging plasma tails. So that's a real long topic, but that one paid a lot of my way through school. So that was a major paper. But anyway, that's kind of a snapshot of how big that array is. If you can imagine a quad, 40-foot element boom length, and then the element length. It was a lot of work, and with Andrew Heliax, and sometimes we use nitrogen cooled Andrew Heliax jacket. So I don't know. I think that's kind of I'm trying not to get too techy with it. WB5D, just WB9EDP.
Thank you, Harry. WB9EDP, Whiskey Bravo 5 Delta, the Medical Amateur Radio Council Grand Rounds on the air net. And of course, today it can be much different. Harry's taking the big muscle approach, and he can, but you don't have to be a big gun to do it. And perhaps we can hear some different from Mike, but there are tutorials online. If you just Google Beginner's Guide to Small Station EME, you'll find the approach that may work for you in your yard to Earth, Moon, Earth, and learn all the basics and the digital modes as well. But let's hear from Mike, WB2FKO. Mike, what is your approach, and do you do EME, or and we'll talk about meteor scatter here as well. What bands, what kind of power levels equipment you use for both of those two types of modalities on amateur radio? Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm not really an EME guy. I have competed in EME contests as part of a multi-op, but I don't do EME at the home QTH. I can tell you just as a general observation that EME on 6 meters is generally really hard to do for a variety of physics reasons. The go-to band is generally 2 meters, and then I would say second is 432 followed by 1296. So 6 meter EME is really tough.
Okay, thank you for that input, and I think that's consistent with Harry was just talking about, putting up antenna systems all the way through 432. So you guys are harmonious on that. And there again, the tutorial does tell you how to do it, but at the end of the day, what happens is you become a little gun, and it's very tough physics-wise because you don't really have the gain. And if you're going to talk to someone, it's probably going to have to be someone that has a high gain antenna on the other end of extremely selectivity and high power on the other end, so you can copy them using the digital modes. Does that seem to ring true there, Mike? Over.
Yeah, that's spot on, Jay.
Okay, well, it's something for you to explore, but I've never done much EME because, for the same reasons you all are talking about, it's not necessarily as technically challenging anymore, and it doesn't necessarily take the required substantial investment. It certainly was not plug and play in the past, but nowadays you got the benefit of not having to invest as much money, having it more plug and play, but you still have those physics limitations that Mike and Harry are talking about for making it happen. So it's not like you can just say, I'm going to talk to any station on Earth, Moon, Earth, but I may have the capability to make some contacts under the right conditions. And auroral propagation is another. We're not really going to go into auroral propagation, but when the aurora are up, and that's not really that pertinent for us here in Florida, so I have no experience with it, but you also have an ionized atmosphere and the capability to make contacts. The meteor scatter, Mike, can you talk a little bit about both for talking long distance on 2 meters, and now that we're getting the VHF characteristics of 6 even so, about MSK 144, meteor scatter, tropospheric ducting? I mean, is that the way you use the modes? Do you use meteor scatter yourself, and what do you use equipment and power-wise? Go ahead, WB2FKO, Whiskey Bravo 5 Delta.
Hey Jay, I do meteor scatter. I've been doing meteor scatter pretty regularly since 2001, when the digital modes first came out. Probably made a few thousand meteor scatter contacts over the years. The idea is that we have random meteors bombarding the Earth all during the day, and what happens is when they enter the lower part of the ionosphere, particularly the E layer, they create ionization, which is electrons and ions, and these trails that are left by the high-speed meteors as they lose their kinetic energy as they come into the atmosphere, they leave these ionization trails that live for a very short amount of time, much less than a second typically. And that ionization trail is capable of reflecting radio signals. So the digital modes like MSK144 are designed to transmit information, just small packets of information at a very, very high rate with the intent that they will that information will be reflected off the meteor trail to a distant station. We're talking about distances of 600 to 1,200 miles typically are what the physics and the geometry allow. And this mode is very, very advanced in the sense that there is what's called forward error correction built into it that allows extremely weak and possibly distorted signals to convey the information over these very, very short time impulses. That's sort of like the top level description of it. I can certainly go into more detail. Go ahead, Jay.
Oh my gosh, thank you very much, Mike. You explained that so eloquently to the average amateur radio operator and those that might be interested in becoming amateur radio operators. So I guess you're saying that those meteor trails, you have to use a very fast mode for the impulses because you won't get the reflections for very long. And if you did not have a fast mode, you would not have the ability to make a two-way contact. Is my take correct on that? Go ahead.
Yep, that's the idea, that you're trying to transmit a minimal amount of information at the highest speed possible. And that's limited by essentially the hardware limitations. The bandwidth of the audio bandwidth of the transceiver, all these things come into play. Just as a rough gauge, it would be about the equivalent of about 3,000 words per minute are the data rates.
Oh my gosh, thank you. I'm glad we have digital communications. I'm struggling with 25 these days as I get older. But I remember talking to K1 DS. He was a pediatrician who moved from Connecticut down to Florida, to Boynton Beach. So he, being in Florida in the retirement area, he lived in a deed restricted community, and he would set up his portable station in the backyard. So he'd have a tripod antenna, and he did have some power, and he would make these types of contacts. So apparently it's quite possible. So is this something, Mike, that you've also done portable, or just when you're fixed at your station? WB2 FKO Whiskey Bravo 5 Delta. Go ahead, Mike.
Yes, I have done portable meteor scatter operations primarily as part of the VHF contest, which I'm quite interested in. So the idea is to take your radio and not necessarily large, but maybe a 3-element beam for 6 meters, or maybe a 5-element beam for 2 meters. Take it out on the road and set up, and you can contact folks over those distances. 600, maybe not 1,200 miles with a portable operation, but certainly I've done it out to 1,000 miles. And you don't need a meteor shower for this. generally happens all during the day, with mornings being a little bit better. Go ahead, Jay.
Thank you for the explanation. So contesting, I guess, is much different on VHF than it is on HF because you're dealing with the Maidenhead square grids, what, 1 by 2 degrees, and you're trying to collect as many of those as possible. So I can imagine with tropospheric ducting, you're limited in how far you're going to go, and maybe meteor scatter gives you opportunity to work more grid squares in different geographic areas. Is that correct, Mike? Go ahead.
Yeah, the idea is meteor scatter is going to allow you to make contacts, QSOs, with distant stations when the band is basically not open. You're not relying on the ionosphere, sustained ionospheric reflection. You're relying on the ability to scatter off or reflect off of the short-lived trails that are bombarding the upper atmosphere constantly. So even on in a dead band, you have propagation to distant stations.
Wonderful explanation, Mike. That's WB2FKO with Whiskey Bravo 5 Delta for the Medical Image Radio Council Grand Rounds on the Internet. Now we have two excellent speakers here with us, or individuals able to answer your discussion on our net. So if you would like to ask a question of either Mike WB2FKO or Harry WB9EDP, I'll make a list here. And of course, you can always use their excellent web QRZ sites for information. But if you'd like to ask a particular question right now, please go ahead and I'll start that list. Make your call to Whiskey Bravo 5 Delta for the list. Okay, just a second, Harry. Do we have anybody outside of Harry and Mike that would like to ask them a specific question? I'll make that list. Go ahead. Okay, no additional questions or comments. So Harry, please elaborate. WB9EDP, this is Whiskey Bravo 5 Delta, take the mic.
Yes, I think that's one way he did it. I did win that award that he's going after, and also an Edgerton award. We have two major sweeps that are mathematically integrated over a course of time. One that typically is around 6 a.m., looking at your local clock, and then 6 p.m. The quantity of meteors that come in, the size of the sand of grain, number well into the trillions. So we see these particles. So part of the paper that I authored was that we would do this with phone, make it capable of giving a weather report over a 2,000-foot distance, and when we did that, we would do it every single day. We did prove that back in, I believe, 1979, and that should have been that's something that I took away the whole section in the VHS contest only on 6 meters, believe it or not. So that stirred a lot of people because I beat one of the biggest stations there. But you can do that, and we did that with phone. You have to know what you're doing. You have to do the math. Well, it's math intensive, but it works, and did that. WB5D, WB9EDP.
Oh, well, thank you, Harry, for the explanation of the approach that you've had to take, especially before the digital modes were available. You and I are aging ourselves since we've both been hams for that long, and many of our members have, and I imagine some of you that are listening here on 20 meters have as well, but others are new to the hobby. So we do appreciate the eloquent way you both explained these modalities. And in a way, we're quite honored to have two space experts there, because the rest of us are just space cadets. Hi. But one other advantage of digital mode operators is they confirm their contacts, usually by logbook of the world, at a very high rate. So if you're doing contests or you're doing award purposes for awards, you're going to get returns without having to send cards to the mail. Now, the VP8 LP station, I talked to in the Falkland Islands, he does unfortunately ask you to send greenbacks and green stamps and return envelope to get a return card. So I had worked in years ago. I worked in the other day, but I'd already gotten my QSL card from them. And that's not true. But for those of you that were hams in the 1960s, 70s, 80s, and you probably remember, like I do, waiting by the post, by your mailbox for all the cards that come in, because you had to collect them for awards. What a wonderful contribution Logbook of the World is, where we can do this almost instantaneously through the internet, where we have blind matching of the contacts from both sides coming up with confirmed contact. But thank you for participating in our net today. Best 6 meter DX to all of you. I hope you'll take advantage of the band conditions, learn to use some of those tools. If you don't have an antenna, gosh, throw a dipole up there, throw a sloper up there, sloper down, put one end 20 up in the air and the other at 6 or 7 in the air. And you're only dealing with what, a 9-foot antenna or 10-foot antenna. I don't have the calculations in front of me, but think of that half wavelength antenna and you're going to get 3 directions of propagation off of that. Three directions off the side of the sloper, out away from the sloper. You'll be able to make lots of contacts. Doesn't take a lot of power when 6 is open. 6 is open, and you're going to find that F2 magic again to be contagious. Enjoy it while it's there. It's going to be fleeting. If anyone has any questions, feel free to email me using my QRZ information. My personal call is Alpha Alpha 4 Foxtrot London. Alpha Alpha 4 Foxtrot London, and my QRZ page does have that email address. Feel free to contact me. And thank you for everyone that's here participating. If you happen to be seeing a video on YouTube and don't have access to the QRZ information, you can just look for the Medical Amateur Radio Council website or gatorradio.org at the University of Florida, and you'll be able to contact me that way through the links to the email there. Again, once again, enjoy amateur radio, enjoy the Magic Band, and thank you for everybody being here with us today. This is Whiskey Bravo 5 Delta bringing the net to a close. We'll be stopping the recording here that we're making for that YouTube video, and then we will be available for those that want to have